Part 3 of The Ethical Engineer by Harry Harrison. Chapter 7. "Drink some more of this," the voice said, and cold water splashed on Jason's face, and some of it trickled down his throat, making him cough. Something hard was pressing into his back, and his wrists hurt. Memory seeped back slowly. The fight, the capture, and the potion that had been forced upon him. When he opened his eyes, he saw a flickering yellow lamp overhead, hung from a chain. He blinked at it and tried to gather enough energy to sit up. A familiar face swam in front of the light, and Jason squinted his eyes at it and groaned. "Is that you, Micah? Or are you just part of a nightmare?" "There is no escape from justice, Jason. It is I, and I have some grave questions to put to you." Jason groaned again. "You're real, all right. Even in a nightmare I wouldn't dare dream up any lines like that. But before the questions, how about telling me a thing or two about the local setup? You should know something, since you have been a slave of the Zertanoi longer than I." Jason realized that the pain in his wrists came from heavy iron shackles. A chain passed through them and was stapled to a thick wooden bar on which his head had been resting. "Why the chains, and what is the local hospitality like?" Micah resisted the invitation to impart any vital information, and returned irresistibly to his own topic. "When I saw you last, you were a slave of Ch'aka, and tonight you were brought in with the other slaves of Ch'aka and chained to the bar while you were unconscious. There was an empty place next to mine, and I told them I would tend you if they placed you there, and they did. Now, there is something I must know. Before they stripped you, I saw that you were wearing the armor and helmet of Ch'aka. Where is the man? What happened to him?" "Me Ch'aka," Jason rasped, and burst out coughing from the dryness in his throat. He took a long drink of water from the bowl. "You sound very vindictive, Micah, you old fraud. Where is all the turn-the-other-cheek stuff now? Don't tell me you could possibly hate the man just because he hit you on the head, fractured your skull, and sold you down the river as a slave reject. In case you have been brooding over this injustice, you can now be cheered, because the evil Ch'aka is no more. He is buried in the trackless wastes, and after all the applications were sifted out, I got the job." "You killed him?" "In a word, yes. And don't think that it was easy, since he had all the advantages and I possessed only my native ingenuity, which luckily proved to be enough. It was touch and go for a while, because when I tried to assassinate him in his sleep—" "You what?" Micah Salmon hissed. "Got to him at night. You don't think anyone in his right mind would tackle a monster like that face to face, do you? Though it ended up that way, since he had some neat gadgets for keeping track of people in the dark. Briefly, we fought, I won, I became Ch'aka, though my reign was neither long nor noble. I followed you as far as the desert, where I was neatly trapped by a shrewd old bird named of Edipon, who demoted me back to the ranks and took away all my slaves as well. Now, that's my story, so tell me yours. Where are we? What goes on here?" "Assassin! Slaveholder!" Micah reared back as far as he could under the restraint of the chain, and pointed the finger of judgment at Jason. "2 more charges must be added to your roll of infamy. I sicken myself, Jason, that I could ever have felt sympathy for you and tried to help you. I will still help you, but only to stay alive, so that you may be taken back to Cassylia for trial and execution." "I like that example of fair and impartial justice. Trial and execution." Jason coughed again and drained the bowl of water. "Didn't you ever hear of presumed innocent until proven guilty? It only happens to be the mainstay of all jurisprudence. And how could you possibly justify trying me on Cassylia for actions that occurred on this planet, that aren't crimes here? That's like taking a cannibal away from his tribe and executing him for anthropophagy." "What would be wrong with that? The eating of human flesh is a crime so loathsome I shudder to think of it. Of course a man who does that must be executed." "If he slips in the back door and eats one of your relatives, you certainly have grounds for action. But not if he joins the rest of his jolly tribe for a good roast of enemy. Don't you see the obvious point here, that human conduct can only be judged in relation to its environment? Conduct is relative. The cannibal in his society is just as moral as the churchgoer in yours." "Blasphemer! A crime is a crime. There are moral laws that stand above all human society." "Oh, no, there are not. That's just the point where your medieval morality breaks down. All laws and ideas are historical and relative, not absolute. They are relevant to their particular time and place, and taken out of context, they lose their importance. Within the context of this grubby society, I acted in a most straightforward and honest manner. I attempted to assassinate my master, which is the only way an ambitious boy can get ahead in this hard world, and which was undoubtedly the way Ch'aka himself got the job in the first place. Assassination didn't work, but combat did, and the results were the same. Once in power, I took good care of my slaves, though of course they didn't appreciate it, since they didn't want good care, they only wanted my job, that being the law of the land. The only thing I really did wrong was to not live up to my obligations as a slaveholder and keep them marching up and down the beaches forever. Instead, I came looking for you, and was trapped and broken back to slavery, where I belong, for pulling such a stupid trick." The door crashed open, and harsh sunlight streamed into the windowless building. "On your feet, slaves!" a Zertano shouted in through the opening. A chorus of shufflings and groans broke out as the men stirred to life. Jason could see now that he was one of 20 slaves shackled to the long bar, apparently the entire trunk of a good-sized tree. The man chained at the far end seemed to be a leader of sorts, because he cursed and goaded the others to life. When they were all standing, he snapped his commands in a hectoring tone of voice. Come on, first come best food. And don't forget your bowls. Put them away so they can't drop out. Remember, nothing to eat or drink all day unless you have a bowl. And let's work together today. Everyone pull his weight. That's the only way to do it. That goes for all you men, especially you new men. Give them a day's work here, and they give you a day's food." "Oh, shut up," someone shouted. "And you can't complain about that," the straw boss whined on, unperturbed. "Now, all together. 1. Bend down and get your hands around the bar and get a good grip. And 2. Lift it clear of the ground. That's the way. And 3. Stand up, and out the door we go." They shuffled out into the sunlight, and the cold wind of dawn bit through his Pyrran coverall and the remains of Ch'aka's leather trappings that Jason had been allowed to keep. His captors had torn off the claw-studded feet, but not bothered the wrappings underneath, so they hadn't found his boots. This was the only bright spot on an otherwise unlimited vista of blackest gloom. Jason tried to be thankful for small blessings, but only shivered some more. As soon as possible, this situation had to be changed, since he had already served his term as slave on this backwoods planet and was cut out for better things. On order, the slaves lined up against the walls of the yard. Presenting their bowls like scruffy penitents, they accepted dippers of lukewarm soup from another slave who pushed along a wheeled tub of the stuff. He was chained to the tub. Jason's appetite vanished when he tasted the sludge. It was Krenoi soup, and the desert tubers tasted even worse. He hadn't thought it was possible, when served up in a broth. But survival was more important than fastidiousness, so he gulped the evil stuff down. Breakfast over, they marched out the gate into another compound, and fascinated interest displaced all of Jason's concerns. In the center of the yard was a large capstan into which the first group of slaves were already fitting the end of their bar. Jason's group and the 2 others shuffled into position and seated their bars, making a 4-spoked wheel out of the capstan. An overseer shouted, and the slaves groaned and threw their weight against the bars until they shuddered and began to turn. Then, trudging slowly, they kept the wheel moving. Once this slogging labor was underway, Jason turned his attention to the crude mechanism that they were powering. A vertical shaft from the capstan turned a creaking wooden wheel that set a series of leather belts into motion. Some of them vanished through openings into a large stone building, while the strongest strap of all turned the rocker arm of what could only be a counterbalanced pump. This all seemed like a highly inefficient way to go about pumping water, since there certainly must be natural springs and lakes somewhere around. The pungent smell that filled the yard was hauntingly familiar, and Jason had just reached the conclusion that water couldn't be the object of their labors when a throaty gurgling came from the standpipe of the pump, and a thick black stream bubbled out. "Petroleum, of course!" Jason enthused out loud, then bent his attentions to pushing when the overseer gave him an ugly look and cracked his whip menacingly. This was the secret of the Zertanoi, and the source of their power. Mountains were visible nearby, and hills towering above the surrounding walls. The captured slaves had been drugged so they would not even know in which direction they had been brought to this hidden site, or how long the trip was. Here in this guarded valley they labored to pump the crude oil that their masters used to power their big desert wagons. Or did they use crude oil for this? The petroleum was gurgling out in a solid stream now, and running down an open trough that vanished through a wall into the same building as the turning belts. And what barbaric devilishness went on in there? A thick chimney crowned the building and produced clouds of black smoke, while from the various openings in the wall came a tremendous stench that threatened to lift the top off of his head. At the same moment he realized what was going on in the building. A guarded door was opened, and Edipon came out, blowing his sizable nose in a scrap of rag. The creaking wheel turned, and when its rotation brought Jason around again, he called out to him. "Hey, Edipon, come over here. I want to talk to you. I'm the former Ch'aka, in case you don't recognize me out of uniform." Edipon gave him one look, then turned away, dabbing at his nose. It was obvious that slaves held no interest for him, no matter what their position had been before their fall. The slave driver ran over with a roar, raising his whip, while the slow rotation of the wheel carried Jason away. He shouted back over his shoulder, "Listen to me. I know a lot and can help you." Only a turned back for an answer, and the whip was already whistling down. It was time for the hard sell. "You had better hear me, because I know that what comes out first is best. Ow!" This last was involuntary as the whip landed. Jason's words were without meaning to the slaves, as well as the overseer, who was raising his whip for another blow, but their impact on Edipon was as dramatic as if he had stepped on a hot coal. He shuddered to a halt and wheeled about, and even at this distance Jason could see that a sickly gray tone had replaced his normal browned color of skin. "Stop the wheel!" he shouted. This unexpected command drew the startled attention of everyone. The gape-mouthed overseer lowered his whip, while the slaves stumbled and halted, and the wheel groaned to a stop. In the sudden silence, Edipon's steps echoed loudly as he ran to Jason, halting a hand's breadth away, his lips drawn back from his teeth with tension as if he were prepared to bite. "What was that you said?" He hurled the words at Jason while his fingers half plucked a knife from his belt. Jason smiled, looking and acting calmer than he felt. His barb had gone home, but unless he proceeded carefully, so would Edipon's knife, into his stomach. This was obviously a very sensitive topic. "You heard what I said, and I don't think you want me to repeat it in front of all these strangers. I know what happens here because I come from a place far away where we do this kind of thing all the time. I can help you. I can show you how to get more of the best, and how to make your caroi work better. Just try me. Only unchain me from this bar first, and let's get to some place private where we can have a nice chat." Edipon's thoughts were obvious. He chewed his lip and looked hotly at Jason, fingering the edge of his knife. Jason only returned a smile of pure innocence and tapped his fingers happily on the bar, just marking time while he waited to be released. Yet in spite of the cold there was a rivulet of sweat trickling down his spine. He was gambling everything on Edipon's intelligence, that the man's curiosity would overcome the immediate desire to silence the slave who knew so much about things so secret, hoping that he would remember that slaves could always be killed, and that it wouldn't hurt to ask a few questions first. Curiosity won, and the knife dropped back into the sheath while Jason let his breath out in a relieved sigh. It had been entirely too close, even for a professional gambler. His own life on the board was a little higher stakes than he enjoyed playing for. "Release him from the bar and bring him to me," Edipon ordered, then strode agitatedly away. The other slaves watched wide-eyed as the blacksmith was rushed out, and with much confusion and shouted orders, Jason's chain was cut from the bar where it joined the heavy staple. "What are you doing?" Micah asked, and one of the guards backhanded him to the ground. Jason just smiled and touched his fingers to his lips as his chain was released, and they led him away. He was free from bondage, and he would stay that way if he could convince Edipon that he would be better off in some capacity other than dumb labor. The room they led him to contained the first touches of decoration or self-indulgence that he had seen on this planet. The furniture was carefully constructed, with an occasional bit of carving to brighten it, and there was a woven cover on the bed. Edipon stood by a table, tapping his fingers nervously on the dark, polished surface. "Lock him up," he ordered the guards, and Jason was secured to a sturdy ring-bolt that projected from the wall. As soon as the guards were gone, he stood before Jason and drew his knife. "Tell me what you know, or I will kill you at once." "My past is an open book to you, Edipon. I come from a land where we know all the secrets of nature." "What is the name of this land? Are you a spy from Appsala?" "I couldn't very well be one, since I have never heard of the place." Jason pulled at his lower lip, wondering just how intelligent Edipon was, and just how frank he could be with him. This was no time to get tangled up in lies about planetary geography. It might be best to try him on a small dose of the truth. "If I told you I came from another planet, another world in the sky, up among the stars, would you believe me?" "Perhaps. There are many old legends that our forefathers came from a world beyond the sky, but I have always dismissed this as religious drivel, fit only for women." "In this case the girls happen to be right. Your planet was settled by men whose ships crossed the emptiness of space as your caroi pass over the desert. Your people have forgotten about that and lost the science and knowledge you once had, but in other worlds the knowledge is still held." "Madness." "Not at all. It is science, though many times confused as being the same thing. I'll prove my point. You know that I could never have been inside your mysterious building out there, and I imagine you can be sure no one has told me of its secrets. Yet I'll bet you that I can describe fairly accurately what is in there, not from seeing the machinery, but from knowing what must be done to oil in order to get the products you need. You want to hear?" "Proceed," Edipon said, sitting on a corner of the table and balancing the knife loosely in his palm. "I don't know what you call it, the device, but in the trade it is a pot still used for fractional distillation. Your crude oil runs into a tank of some kind, and you pipe it from there to a retort, some big vessel that you can seal airtight. Once it is closed, you light a fire under the thing and try to get all the oil to an even temperature. A gas rises from the oil, and you take it off through a pipe and run it through a condenser, probably more pipe with water running over it. Then you put a bucket under the open end of the pipe, and out of it drips the juice that you burn in your caroi to make them move." Edipon's eyes opened wider and wider while Jason talked, until they stuck out of his head like boiled eggs. "Demon!" he screeched, and tottered toward Jason with the knife extended. "You couldn't have seen, not through stone walls, yet only my family have seen, no others, I'll swear to that." "Keep cool, Edipon. I told you that we have been doing this stuff for years in my country." He balanced on one foot, ready for a kick at the knife in case the old man's nerves did not settle down. "I'm not out to steal your secrets. In fact, they are pretty small potatoes where I come from, since every farmer has a still for cooking up his own mash and saving on taxes. I'll bet I can even put in some improvements for you, sight unseen. How do you monitor the temperature on your cooking brew? Do you have thermometers?" "What are thermometers?" Edipon asked, forgetting the knife for the moment, drawn on by the joys of a technical discussion. "That's what I thought. I can see where your bootleg joy juice is going to take a big jump in quality, if you have anyone here who can do some simple glass blowing, though it might be easier to rig up a coiled bimetallic strip. You're trying to boil off your various fractions, and unless you keep an even and controlled temperature, you are going to have a mixed brew. The thing you want for your engines are the most volatile fractions, the liquids that boil off first, like gasoline and benzene. After that, you raise the temperature and collect kerosene for your lamps, and so forth, right on down the line until you have a nice mass of tar left to pave your roads with. How does that sound to you?" Edipon had forced himself into calmness, though a jumping muscle in his cheek betrayed his inner tension. "What you have described is truth, though you were wrong on some small things, but I am not interested in your thermometer, nor in improving our water of power. It has been good enough for my family for generations, and it is good enough for me." "I bet you think that line is original." "There is something that you might be able to do that would bring you rich rewards. We can be generous when needs be. You have seen our caroi and ridden on one, and seen me go into the shrine to intercede with the sacred powers to make us move. Can you tell me what power moves the caroi?" "I hope this is the final exam, Edipon, because you are stretching my powers of extrapolation. Stripping away all the shrines and sacred powers, I would say that you go into the engine room to do a piece of work with very little praying involved. There could be a number of ways of moving those barns, but let's think of the simplest. This is top of the head now, so no penalties if I miss any of the fine points. Internal combustion is out. I doubt if you have the technology to handle it, plus the fact that there was a lot to do about the water tank, and it took you almost an hour to get underway. That sounds like you were getting up a head of steam. The safety valve! I forgot about that. So it is steam. You go in, lock the door, of course, then open a couple of valves until the fuel drips into the firebox. Then you light it. Maybe you have a pressure gauge, or maybe you just wait until the safety valve pops to tell you if you have a head of steam, which can be dangerous since a sticking valve could blow the whole works right over the mountain. Once you have the steam, you crack a valve and let it into the cylinders and get the thing moving. After that, you just enjoy the trip. Of course, making sure the water is feeding to your boiler all right, that your pressure stays up, your fire is hot enough, all your bearings are lubricated, and the rest." Jason looked on astounded as Edipon did a little jig around the room. Holding his robe up above his bony knees, bouncing with excitement, he jabbed his knife into the tabletop and rushed over to Jason and grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him until his chain rattled. "Do you know what you have done?" he asked. "Do you know what you have said?" "I know well enough. Does this mean that I have passed the exam? Was I right?" "I don't know if you are right or not. I have never seen the inside of one of the Upsalan Devil boxes." He danced around the room again. "You know more about their, what do you call it, engine, than I do. I have only spent my life tending them and cursing the people of Uppsala who keep the secret from us. But you will reveal it to us. We will build our own engines, and if they want water of power, they will have to pay dearly for it." Would you mind being a little bit clearer?" Jason pleaded. "I have never heard anything so confused in my entire life." "I will show you, man from a far world, and you will reveal the Uppsalan secrets to us. I see the dawn of a new day for Putl'ko arriving." He opened the door and shouted for the guards and for his son Narsisi, who arrived as they were unlocking Jason, who recognized him as the same droop-eyed and sleepy-looking Zertano who had been helping Edipon to drive their ungainly vehicle. "Seize this chain, my son, and keep your club ready to kill this slave if he makes any attempt to escape. Otherwise, do not harm him, for he is very valuable. Come!" He tugged on the chain, but Jason only dug his heels in and did not move. They looked at him astonished. "Just a few things before we go. The man who is to bring the new day to Putl'ko is not a slave. Let us get that straight before this operation goes any further. We'll work out something with chains or guards so I can't escape, but the slavery thing is out." "But you are not one of us, therefore you must be a slave." "I've just added a third category to your social order. Employee. Though reluctant, I am still an employee, skilled labor, and I intend to be treated that way. Figure it out for yourself. Kill a slave, and what do you lose? Very little if there is another slave in the pens that can push in the same place. But kill me, and what do you get? Brains on your club, and they do you no good at all there." "Say, Dad, does he mean I can't kill him?" Narsisi looked puzzled as well as sleepy. "No, he doesn't mean that. He means if we kill him, there is no one else that can do the work he is to do for us. I can understand him, and I do not like it. There are only slaves and slavers. Anything else is against the natural order. But he has us trapped between Satano and the sandstorm, so we must allow him some freedoms. Bring the slave now, the employee, and we will see if he can do the things he has promised. If he does not, I will have the pleasure of killing him because I do not like his revolutionary ideas." They marched single file to a locked and guarded building with immense doors, which were pulled open to reveal the massive forms of 7 Caroi. "Look at them," Edipon hissed and tugged at his nose. "The finest and most beautiful constructions, striking fear into our enemies' hearts, carrying us fleetingly across the sands, bearing on their backs immense loads, and only 3 of the things are able to move." "Engine trouble?" Jason asked lightly. Edipon grumbled, cursed, and fumed under his breath, and led the way to an inner courtyard where stood 4 immense black boxes, painted with death heads, splintered bones, fountains of blood, and cabalistic symbols of a sinister appearance. "Those swine in Uppsala take our water of power and give nothing in return. Oh, yes, they let us use their engines, but after running for a few months the cursed things stop and will not go again. Then we must bring them back to the city to exchange for a new one, and pay again and again." "A nice racket," Jason said, looking at the sealed coverings on the engines. "Why don't you just crack into them and fix them yourself? They can't be very complex." "That is death," Edipon gasped, and both Zertanoi recoiled from the boxes at the thought. "We have tried that in my father's day, since we are not superstitious like the slaves and know that these are man-made, not God-made. However, the tricky serpents of Uppsala hide their secrets with immense cunning. If any attempt is made to break the covering, horrible death leaks out and fills the air. Men who breathe the air die, and even those who are solely touched by it develop immense blisters and die in pain. The men of Uppsala laughed when this happened to our people, and after that raised the price even higher." Jason circled one of the boxes, examining it with interest, trailing Narsisi behind him at the end of the chain. The thing was higher than his head and almost twice as long. A heavy shaft emerged through openings on opposite sides, probably the power takeoff for the wheels. Through an opening in the side he could see inset handles and 2 small colored discs, and above this were 3 funnel-shaped openings, shaped and painted like mouths. By standing on tiptoe, Jason looked on the top, but there was only a flanged, sooty opening that might be for the attachment of a smokestack. There was only one more opening, a smallish one in the rear, and no other controls on the garish container. "I'm beginning to get the picture, but you will have to tell me how you work the controls." "Death before that!" Narsisi shouted. "Only my family—" "Will you shut up?" Jason shouted right back. "Remember? You're not allowed to browbeat the help anymore. There are no secrets here. Not only that, but I probably know more about this thing than you do just by looking at it. Oil, water, and fuel go in these 3 openings. You poke a light in somewhere, probably in that smoky hole under the controls. Open one of those valves for fuel supply, another one is to make the engine go slower and faster, and the third is for your water feed. The discs are indicators of some kind." Narsisi paled and stepped back. "So keep the trap shut while I talk to your dad?" "It is as you say," Edipon pointed. "The mouths must always be filled, and woe betide if they shall go empty, for the powers will halt, or worse. Fire goes in here as you guessed, and when the green finger comes forward this lever may be turned for motion. The next is for great speed or going slow. The very last is under the sign of the red finger, which when it points indicates need, and the handle must be turned and held until the finger retires. White breath comes from the opening in back. That is all there is." "About what I expected," Jason muttered, and examined the container wall, rapping it with his knuckles until it boomed. "They give you the minimum of controls to run the thing, so you won't learn anything about the basic principles involved. Without the theory, you would never know what the handles control, or that the green indicator comes out when you have operating pressure, or the red one when the water level is low in the boiler. Very neat. And the whole thing sealed up in a can and booby-trapped in case you have any ideas of going into business for yourself. The cover sounds like it is double-walled, and from your description I would say that it has one of the vesicant war gases, like mustard gas, sealed inside there in liquid form. Anyone who tries to cut their way in will quickly forget their ambitions after a dose of that. Yet there must be a way to get inside the case and service the engine. They aren't going to throw them away after a few months' use. And considering the level of technology displayed by this monstrosity, I should be able to find the tricks and get around any other built-in traps. I think I'll take the job. Very well. Begin. Wait a minute, boss. You still have a few things to learn about hired labor. There are always certain working conditions and agreements involved, all of which I'll be happy to list for you. Chapter 8. What I do not understand is why you must have the other slave, Narcisse whined. To have the woman, of course, is natural, as well as to have quarters of your own. My father has given his permission, but he also said that I and my brothers are to help you, that the secrets of the engine are to be revealed to no one else. Then trot right over to him and get permission for the slave Micah to join me in the work. You can explain that he comes from the same land that I do, and that your secrets are mere children's toys to him. And if Dad wants any other reasons, tell him that I need skilled aid. Someone who knows how to handle tools, and who can be trusted to follow directions exactly as given. You and your brothers have entirely too many ideas of your own about how things should be done, and a tendency to leave details up to the gods, and have a good bash with the hammer if things don't work the way they should. Narcisse retired, seething and mumbling to himself, while Jason huddled over the oil stove, planning the next step. It had taken most of the day to lay down logs for rollers and push the sealed engine out into the sandy valley far from the well site. Open space was needed for any experiments where a mistake could release a cloud of war gas. Even Edipon had finally seen the sense of this, though all of his tendencies were to conduct the experiments with great secretiveness behind locked doors. He had granted permission only after skin walls had been erected to form an enclosure that could be guarded. It was only incidental that they acted as a much appreciated windbreak. After much argument, the dangling chains and shackles had been removed from Jason's arms, and lightweight leg irons substituted. He had to shuffle when he walked, but his arms were completely free, a great improvement over the chains, even though one of the brothers kept watch with a cocked crossbow as long as Jason wasn't fastened down. Now he had to get some tools and some idea of the technical knowledge of these people before he could proceed, which would necessarily entail one more battle over their precious secrets. "Come on," he called to his guard. "Let's find Edipon and give his ulcers another twinge." After his first enthusiasm, the leader of the Zertanoi was getting very little pleasure out of his new project. "You have quarters of your own," he grumbled, "and a slave woman to cook for you, and I have just given permission for the other slave to help you. Now, more requests. Do you want to drain all the blood from my body?" "Let's not dramatize it too much. I simply want some tools to get on with my work, and a peek at your machine shop, or wherever it is you do your mechanical work. I have to have some idea of the way you people solve mechanical problems before I can go to work on that box of tricks out there in the desert." "Entrance is forbidden." "Regulations are snapping like straws today, so we might as well go on and finish off a few more. Will you lead the way?" The guards were reluctant to open the refinery building gates to Jason, and there was much rattling of keys and worried looks. A brace of elderly Zertanoi stinking of oil fumes emerged from the interior and joined in a shouted argument with Edipon, whose will finally prevailed. Chained again and guarded like a murderer, Jason was begrudgingly led into the dark interior, the contents of which was depressingly anticlimactic. "Really from Rubeville," Jason sneered and kicked at the box full of hand-forged and clumsy tools. The work was of the crudest, the product of a sort of Neolithic machine age. The distilling retort had been laboriously formed from sheet copper and clumsily riveted together. It leaked mightily, as did the soldered seams on the hand-formed pipe. Most of the tools were blacksmith's tongs and hammers for heating and beating out shapes on the anvil. The only thing that gladdened Jason's heart were the massive drill press and the lathe that worked off the slave-powered drive belts. In the tool holder of the lathe was clamped a chip of some hard mineral that did a good enough job of cutting the forged iron and low-carbon steel. Even more cheering was the screw thread advance on the cutting head that was used to produce the massive nuts and bolts that secured the caroi wheels to their shafts. It could have been worse. Jason sorted out the smallest and handiest tools and put them aside for his own use in the morning. The light was almost gone, and there would be no more work this day. They left in armed procession as they came, and a brace of brothers showed him to the kennel-like rooms that was to be his private quarters. The heavy bolt thudded shut in the door behind him, and he winced at the thick fumes of half-burnt kerosene through which the light of the single-wick lamp barely penetrated. Ijal crouched over the small oil stove, cooking something in a pottery bowl. She looked up and smiled hesitatingly at Jason, then turned back to the stove. Jason walked over, sniffed, and shuddered. What a feast! Krenoi soup, and I suppose followed by fresh krenoi and krenoi salad. Tomorrow I see about getting a little variety into the diet. Cha'aka is great, she whispered without looking up. Cha'aka is powerful. Jason is the name. I lost the Cha'aka job when they took the uniform away. Jason is powerful to work charms on the Zertanoi and make them do what he will. His slave thanks you. He lifted her chin, and the dumb obedience in her eyes made him wince. Can't we forget about the slavery bit? We are in this thing together, and we'll get out of it together. We will escape. I knew it. You will kill all the Zertanoi and release your slaves and lead us home again, where we can march and find Krenoi, far from this terrible place. Some girls are sure easy to please. That is roughly what I had in mind, except when we get out of here we are going in the other direction, as far away from your Krenoi crowd as I can get. Ijal listened attentively, stirring the soup with one hand and scratching inside her leather wrappings with the other. Jason found himself scratching as well, and realized from sore spots on his hide that he had been doing an awful lot of this since he had been dragged out of the ocean of this inhospitable planet. Enough is enough, he exploded, and went over and hammered on the door. This place is a far cry from civilization as I know it, but that is no reason why we can't be as comfortable as possible. Chains and bolts rattled outside the door, and Narcisse pushed his gloom-ridden face in. Why do you cry out? What is wrong? I need some water. Lots of it. But you have water, Narcisse said, puzzled, and pointed to a stone crock in the corner. There is water there enough for days. By your standards, Nars, old boy, not mine. I want at least 10 times as much as that, and I want it now. And some soap if there is such stuff in this barbaric place. There was a good deal of argument involved, but Jason finally got his way with the water by explaining it would be needed for religious rites to make sure that he would not fail in the work tomorrow. It came in a varied collection of containers, along with a shallow bowl full of powerful soft soap. We're in business, he chortled. Take off your clothes. I have a surprise for you. Yes, Jason, Ijal said, smiling happily. You're going to get a bath. Do you know what a bath is? No, she said, and shuddered. It sounds evil. Over here and off with the clothes, he ordered, poking at a hole in the floor. This should serve as a drain. At least the water went away when I poured some into it. The water was warm from the stove, yet Ijal still crouched against the wall and shuddered when he poured it over her. She screamed when he rubbed the slippery soap into her hair, and he continued with his hand over her mouth so that she wouldn't bring in the guards. He rubbed the soap into his own head, too, and it tingled delightfully as it soaked through to his scalp. Some of it was in his ears, muffling them, so the first intonation he had that the door was opened was the sound of Micah's hoarse shout. He was standing in the doorway, finger pointed and shaking with wrath. Narcisse was standing behind him, peering over his shoulder with fascination at this weird religious rite. Degradation! Micah thundered. You force this poor creature to bend to your will, humiliate her, strip her clothes from her, and gaze upon her though you are not united in lawful wedlock. He shielded his eyes from sight with a raised arm. You are evil, Jason, a demon of evil, and must be brought to justice. Out! Jason roared, and spun Micah about and started him through the door with one of his practiced Cha'aka kicks. The only evil here is in your mind, you snooping scut. I'm giving the girl the first scrubbing of her life, and you should be giving me a medal for bringing sanitation to the natives instead of howling like that. He pushed them both out the door and shouted at Narsisi. "I want this slave, but not now. Lock him up until morning, then bring him back." He slammed the door and made a mental note to get a hold of a bolt to be placed on this side as well. There were more krenoi for breakfast, but Jason was feeling too good physically to mind. He was scrubbed raw and clean, and the itching was gone even from his sprouting beard. The metal cloth of his Pyrran coverall had dried almost as soon as it had been washed, so he was wearing clean clothes as well. Ijal was still recovering from the traumatic effects of her bath, but she looked positively attractive with her skin cleaned and her hair washed and combed a bit. He would have to find some of the local cloth for her, since it would be a shame to ruin the good work by letting her get back into the badly cured skins she was used to wearing. It was with a sensation of positive good feeling that he bellowed for the door to be opened and stamped through the cool morning to his place of labor. Micah was already there, looking scruffy and angry as he rattled his chains. Jason gave him the friendliest of smiles that only rubbed salt into the other's moral wounds. "Leg irons for him, too," Jason ordered, "and do it fast. We have a big job to do today." He turned back to the sealed engine, rubbing his hands together with anticipation. The concealing hood was made of thin metal that could not hide many secrets. He carefully scratched away some of the paint and discovered a crimped and soldered joint where the sides met, but no other revealing marks. After an hour spent tapping all over with his ear pressed to the metal, he was sure that the hood was just what he had thought it was when he first examined the thing. A double-walled metal container filled with liquid. Puncture it and you were dead. It was there merely to hide the secrets of the engine and served no other function, yet it had to be passed to service the steam engine. Or did it? The construction was roughly cubical, and the hood covered only 5 sides. What about the 6th? The base? "Now you're thinking, Jason," he chortled to himself and knelt down to examine it. A wide flange, apparently of cast iron, projected all around, and it was penetrated by 4 large bolt holes. The protective casting seemed to be soldered to the base, but there must be stronger, concealed attachments, because it would not move even after he carefully scratched away some of the solder at the base. Therefore, the answer simply had to be on the 6th side. "Over here, Micah," he called, and the man detached himself reluctantly from the warmth of the stove and shuffled up. "Come close and look at this medieval motive power while we talk as if we are discussing business. Are you going to cooperate with me?" "I do not want to, Jason. I am afraid that you will soil me with your touch as you have others." "Well, you're not so clean now." "I do not mean physically." "Well, I do. You could certainly do with a bath and a deep shampoo. I'm not worried about the state of your soul. You can battle that out on your own time. But if you work with me, I'll find a way to get us out of this place and to the city that made this engine, because if there is a way off this planet, we'll find it only in the city." "I know that, yet still I hesitate." "Small sacrifices now for the greater good later. Isn't the entire purpose of this trip to get me back to justice? You're not going to accomplish that by rotting out the rest of your life as a slave." "You are the devil's advocate, the way you twist my conscience. Yet what you say is true. I will help you here so that we can escape." "Fine. Now get to work. Take Narsisi and have him round up at least 3 good-sized poles, the kind we were chained to in the pumping gang. Bring them back here along with a couple of shovels." Slaves carried the poles only as far as the outside of the skin walls, since Edipon would not admit them inside, and it was up to Jason and Micah to drag them laboriously to the site. The Zertanoi, who never did physical labor, thought it was very funny when Jason suggested that they help. Once in position by the engine, Jason dug channels beneath it and forced the bars under. When this was done, he took turns with Micah in digging out the sand beneath until the engine stood over a pit supported only by the bars. Jason let himself down and examined the bottom of the machine. It was smooth and featureless. Once more he scratched away the paint with careful precision until it was cleared around the edges. Here the solid metal gave way to solder, and he picked at this until he discovered that a piece of sheet metal had been soldered at the edges and fastened to the bed plate. Very tricky, these Upsilanoi. He chortled and attacked the solder with a knife blade. When one end was loose he slowly pulled the sheet of metal away, making positive that there was nothing attached to it, nor that it had been booby-trapped in any way. It came off easily enough and clanged down into the pit. The revealed surface was smooth metal, featureless and hard. "Enough for one day," Jason said, climbing out of the pit and brushing off his hands. It was almost dark. "We've accomplished enough for now, and I want to think a bit before I go ahead. So far, luck has been on our side, but I don't think it should be this easy. I hope you brought your suitcase with you, Micah, because you're moving in with me." "Never! A sink of sin, depravity!" Jason looked him coldly in the eye, and with each word he spoke he stabbed him in the chest with his finger to drive the point home. "You are moving in with me because that is essential to our plans. If you stop referring to my moral weaknesses, I'll stop talking about yours. Now come on." Living with Micah Salmon was trying, but barely possible. He made Iljal and Jason go to the far wall and turn their backs, and promised not to look while he bathed behind a screen of skins. Jason did this, but exacted a small revenge by telling Ijal jokes so that they tittered together and Micah would be sure they were laughing at him. The screen of skins remained after the bath and was reinforced, and Micah retired behind it to sleep. Their food still consisted only of krenoi, and Jason shuddered while he admitted that he was actually growing used to them. The following morning, under the frightened gaze of his guards, Jason tackled the underside of the base plate. He had been thinking about it a good part of the night, and he put his theories to the test at once. By pressing hard on a knife he could make a good groove in the metal. It was not as soft as the solder, but seemed to be some simple alloy containing a good percentage of lead. What could it be concealing? Probing carefully with the point of the knife, he covered the bottom in a regular pattern. The depth of the metal was uniformly deep, except in two spots where he found irregularities. They were on the midline of the rectangular base and equidistant from the ends and sides. Picking and scraping, he uncovered two familiar-looking shapes, each as big as his head. "Micah, get down in this hole and look at these things. Tell me what you think they are." Micah scratched his head. "They're still covered with this metal. I can't be sure." "I'm not asking you to be sure of anything. Just tell me what they make you think of." "Why, big nuts, of course, threaded on the ends of bolts. But they are so big." "They would have to be if they hold the entire metal case on. I think we are getting very close now to the mystery of how to open the engine, and this is the time to be careful. I still can't believe it is as easy as this to crack the secret. I'm going to whittle a wooden template of the nut, then have a wrench made. While I'm gone, you stay down here and pick all the metal off the bolt and out of the screw threads. I can put off doing it while we think this thing through, but sooner or later I'm going to have to take a stab at turning one of those nuts, and I find it very hard to forget about that mustard gas." Making the wrench put a small strain on the local technology, and all of the old men who enjoyed the title of Masters of the Still went into consultation over it. One of them was a fair blacksmith, and after a ritual sacrifice and a round of prayers, he shoved a bar of iron into the charcoal, and Jason pumped the bellows until it glowed white hot. With much hammering and cursing, it was laboriously formed into a sturdy open-end wrench, with an offset head to get at the countersunk nuts. Jason made sure that the opening was slightly undersized, then took the untempered wrench to the worksite and filed the jaws to an exact fit. After being reheated and quenched in oil, he had the tool that he hoped would do the job. Edipon must have been keeping track of the work progress, because he was waiting near the engine when Jason returned with the completed wrench. "I have been under," he announced, "and have seen the nuts that the devilish Upsilanoi have concealed with solid metal. Who would have suspected? It still seems to me impossible that one metal could be hidden with another. How could that be done?" "Easy enough. The base of the assembled engine was put into a form and the molten covering metal poured into it. It must have a much lower melting point than the steel of the engine, so there would be no damage. They just have a better knowledge of metal technology in the city and counted on your ignorance." "Ignorance? You insult—" I take it back. I just meant they thought they could get away with the trick, and since they didn't, they are the stupid ones. Does that satisfy you?" "What do you do next?" I take off the nuts, and when I do there's a good chance that the poison hood will be released and can simply be lifted off. It is too dangerous for you to do. The fiends may still have other traps ready when the nut is turned. I will send a strong slave to turn them while we watch from a distance. His death will not matter. I'm touched by your concern for my health, but as much as I would like to take advantage of the offer, I cannot. I've been over the same ground and reached the reluctant conclusion that this is one job of work that I have to do myself. Taking off those nuts looks entirely too easy, and that's what makes me suspicious. I'm going to do it and look out for any more trickery at the same time, and that is something that only I can do. Now, I suggest you withdraw with the troops to a safer spot." There was no hesitation about leaving. Footsteps rustled quickly on the sand, and Jason was alone. The leather walls flapped slackly in the wind, and there was no other sound. Jason spat on his palms, controlled a slight shiver, and slid into the pit. The wrench fitted neatly over the nut. He wrapped both hands around it, and bracing his leg against the pit wall, began to pull. And stopped. 3 turns of thread on the bolt projected below the nut, scraped clean of metal by the industrious mica. Something about them looked very wrong, but he didn't know quite what. "Mica!" he shouted, and had to call loudly 2 more times before his assistant poked his head tentatively around the screen. "Nip over to the petroleum works and get me one of their bolts threaded with a nut, any size, it doesn't matter." Jason warmed his hands by the stove until Mica returned with the oily bolt, then waved him out to rejoin the others. Back in the pit, he held it up next to the protruding section of Upsilon bolt and chortled with joy. The threads on the angle bolt were canted at a slightly different angle. Where one ran up, the other ran down. The Upsilon threads had been cut in reverse, with a left-hand thread. Throughout the galaxy there existed as many technical and cultural differences as there were planets. Yet one of the few things they all had in common, inherited from their terrestrial ancestors, was a uniformity of thread. Jason had never thought about it before, but when he mentally ran through his experiences on different planets, he realized that they were all the same. Screws went into wood, bolts went into threaded holes, and nuts all went onto bolts when you turned them with a clockwise motion. Counterclockwise removed them. In his hand was the crude Zertano nut and bolt, and when he tried it, it moved in the same manner. But the engine bolt did not work that way. It had to be turned clockwise to remove it. Dropping the nut and bolt, he placed the wrench on the massive engine bolt and slowly applied pressure in what felt like the completely wrong direction, as if he were tightening, not loosening. It gave slowly, first a quarter, then a half turn, and bit by bit the projection threads vanished until they were level with the surface of the nut. It turned easily now, and within a minute it fell into the pit. He threw the wrench after it and scrambled out. Standing at the edge, he carefully sniffed the air, ready to run at the slightest smell of gas. There was nothing. The second nut came off as easily as the first, and with no ill effects. Jason pushed a sharp chisel between the upper case and the base plate where he had removed the solder, and when he leaned on it, the case shifted slightly, held down only by its own weight. From the entrance to the enclosure he shouted to the group huddled in the distance, "Come on back. This job is almost finished." They all took turns at sliding into the pit and looking at the projecting bolts, and made appreciative sounds when Jason leaned on the chisel and showed how the case was free. "There is still the little matter of taking it off," he told them, "and I'm sure that grabbing and heaving is the wrong way. That was my first idea too, but the people who assembled that thing had some bad trouble in store for anyone who tightened those nuts instead of loosening them. Until we find out what that is, we are going to tread very lightly. Do you have any big blocks of ice around here, Edipon? It is winter now, isn't it?" "Ice? Winter?" Edipon mumbled, caught off guard by the change of direction, rubbing abstractedly at the reddened tip of his prominent nose. "Of course it is winter. Ice. There must be ice at the higher lakes in the mountain. They are always frozen at this time of year. But what do you want the ice for?" "You get it and I'll show you. Have it cut in nice flat blocks that I can stack. I'm not going to lift the hood. I'm going to drop the engine out from underneath it." By the time the slaves had brought the ice down from the distant lakes, Jason had rigged a strong wooden frame flat on the ground around the engine and pushed sharpened metal wedges under the hood, then had secured the wedges to the frame. Now, if the engine was lowered into the pit, the hood would stay above, supported by the wedges. The ice would take care of this. Jason built a foundation of ice under the engine, then slipped out the supporting bars. Now, as the ice slowly melted, the engine would be gently lowered into the pit. The weather remained cold, and the ice refused to melt until Jason had the pit ringed with smoking oil stoves. Water began to run down into the pit, and Micah went to work bailing it out, while the gap between the hood and the base plate widened. The melting continued for the rest of the day and almost all of the night. Red-eyed and exhausted, Jason and Micah supervised the soggy sinking, and when the Zertanoi returned at dawn, the engine rested safely in a pool of mud on the bottom of the pit. The hood was off. "They're tricky devils over there in Uppsala, but Jason dinAlt wasn't born yesterday," he exulted. "Do you see that crock sitting there on top of the engine?" He pointed to a sealed container of thick glass, the size of a small barrel, filled with an oily, greenish liquid. It was clamped down tightly with padded supports. "That's the booby trap. The nuts I took off were on the threaded ends of two bars that held the hood on, but instead of being fastened directly to the hood, they were connected by a crossbar that rested on top of that jug. If either nut was tightened instead of being loosened, the bar would have bent and broken the glass. I'll give you exactly one guess as to what would have happened then." "The poison liquid?" "None other. And the double-walled hood is filled with it, too. I suggest that as soon as we have dug a deep hole in the desert, the hood and container be buried and forgotten about. I doubt if the engine has many other surprises in store, but I'll be careful as I work on it." "You can fix it? You know what's wrong with it?" Edipon was vibrating with joy. "Not yet. I have barely looked at the thing. In fact, one look was enough to convince that the job would be as easy as stealing krenoi from a blind man. The engine is as inefficient and clumsy in construction as your petroleum still. If you people put 1/10 of the energy into research and improving your product as you do into hiding it from the competition, you would all be flying jets." "I forgive your insult because you have done us a service. You will now fix this engine and the other engines. A new day is breaking for us." "Right now, it's a new night that is breaking for me," Jason yawned. "I have 2 days' sleep to make up. See if you can talk your sons into wiping the water off that engine before it rusts away, and when I get back I'll see what I can do about getting it into running condition."